Hi, my name's Zane. I'm 22, and most days I feel like I'm just passing through places that never really notice I was there. It had been raining for hours when I stopped in front of that porch, not because I was expected, but because the light in the window was still on. A sudden downpour hit during my last delivery of the day. I stood in front of an old house hoodie soaked through hands, shaking from the cold. I knocked, not expecting much, just trying to avoid getting wetter. The street was already half flooded, and the scooter I parked by the curb hissed faintly as water hit its still warm engine. My sneakers squelched with each shift of my weight. I was freezing tired and ready for this day to end. The house looked worn, but cared for green paint faded gently by time, the porch light casting a soft amber glow against the rain. I'd never been on this part of the route before. Something about the window frame slightly uneven and the wreath hanging crooked on the door made me feel like I'd stumbled into a place that had its own slow rhythm. A place that didn't hurry for anyone. The door opened after a pause. A woman stood there barefoot on polished wood, wearing a loose sweater the color of oatmeal and a quiet, steady expression. She didn't flinch at the sight of a drenched stranger. "You're soaked," she said with a calm, almost amused smile. "Come in. You can't finish your shift like that." It wasn't a question. She stepped aside, leaving the door open. I hesitated. This wasn't normal. Customers usually nodded, took their stuff, closed the door. Efficient, anonymous. But something about her tone made it feel okay. I stepped in carefully, wiping my feet more out of instinct than etiquette. The house smelled like cinnamon and something herbal. A lamp on a side table filled the room with soft yellow light, not too bright, just enough to feel lived in. There was a faint sound of jazz coming from somewhere deeper inside, the kind of music you don't notice at first but miss when it stops. "Leave your jacket on that hook," she said, walking into the kitchen without looking back. "I'll get you a towel." I did as she said. Water dripped onto the welcome mat, but she didn't seem to mind. I stood awkwardly, unsure if I was supposed to sit or just wait. A dog bed sat empty near the couch, its cover slightly crumpled as if recently vacated. A few books lay in uneven stacks beside a chair. It was a mess, but the kind that made you feel invited, not judged. She came back holding a towel and handed it to me without a word. It was warm from the dryer. That small detail knocked something loose in me. I dried my hair slowly, trying not to look at her too much, but she was watching me curiously, not intensely. "Thank you," I said, voice low. "I didn't mean to intrude." She shook her head. "It's just rain. You didn't break in." A pause. Then, with a gentleness I didn't expect, she added, "Sometimes it's good to stop moving for a second." I glanced at the window. Rain streamed down the glass in ribbons. Outside felt far away now. I sat down on the edge of the couch, still holding the towel. She moved to a cabinet, returned with a second mug, and poured tea without asking what I liked. She handed it to me. Chamomile, maybe, or some blend I couldn't name. It smelled safe. "I'm Melissa," she said. "You?" "Zane," I replied. My voice always felt small in quiet rooms like this. She nodded. "Nice to meet you, Zane." The tea was hot. I cradled it in my hands like it might anchor me. We didn't speak for a few minutes. The jazz kept playing low and steady. Ali, the dog whose bed I'd noticed, peeked in from the hallway, sniffed the air, then padded off again. I glanced around. The blanket folded neatly over the armrest, the extra mug, the second hook by the door. This place had been ready for someone. Maybe not me, but someone, and yet here I was warming my hands on a borrowed cup of tea, sitting in a room that felt like it had always existed, just slightly out of reach. Melissa didn't fill the silence. She didn't ask if I had a story or somewhere else to be. She just sat across from me, sipping her tea like this was part of her ordinary evening. Like I belonged here as much as the rain outside did. I didn't know how long I stayed. 20 minutes 40. It didn't feel like time passed at all. She stood, eventually gathering our empty cups. "If you're not in a rush," she said as she passed behind me. "There's more tea." I nodded barely. It wasn't about the tea. It was the first time in a long while I hadn't felt like I needed to be anywhere else. "If you're not in a rush," she said as she passed behind me. There's more tea. I told myself I wouldn't go back, but the porch light was always on, and somehow that made it harder not to. Every time I turned down her street on deliveries, I'd glance at that soft glow like it meant something. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she just forgot to turn it off. Or maybe some part of her knew someone out there needed that light. I'd find excuses to ride past. Extra napkins, a misprinted receipt, a double check on an address that didn't really need double checking. And each time the same quiet invitation hummed behind her windows. When I finally knocked again, 4 days after that first night, I wasn't soaked. The sky was clear, but the air still smelled like wet earth. She opened the door wearing a cardigan and holding a watering can. "Em again," she said. "Not surprised?" I shrugged. "Had a return. Thought you might need your receipt." Melissa didn't call me out on the lie. She stepped aside and let me in just like before. Ali barked once from the back of the house, but didn't come closer. There was no jazz playing this time. Just the soft hiss of a kettle warming on the stove and a window cracked open to the late afternoon breeze. I sat on the same spot on the couch. The towel I'd used the other night was folded neatly on the armrest exactly where I'd left it. Or maybe she'd placed it there again. I didn't ask. She brought out 2 mugs. Different blend today, minty sharper, waking something up instead of calming it down. "You work a lot," she said as she handed me mine. "Too much, probably, but you come back here." She didn't say it like an accusation, just a fact. I didn't have a reply. I sipped the tea. Melissa sat across from me again, cross-legged, her sweater slipping off one shoulder. There was a silence between us that didn't itch. It just sat there, soft and necessary. She watched the steam rise from her mug like it held a story only she could read. "Did you always live here?" I asked finally, needing to fill the stillness with something. "For a while. Moved in after things fell apart elsewhere." "Family, marriage." I nodded, not pushing. She didn't offer more, and I didn't ask. Ali eventually crept closer, sniffed my shoes, and sat at my feet. I reached down slowly, letting him decide. He leaned into my palm like he'd done this 100 times. Melissa smiled faintly. He remembers who's kind. That stayed with me. As the sun dipped lower, golden light stretched across the wooden floor. She lit a candle on the table. I don't know why. It wasn't dark yet. Maybe she liked how the flame flickered against the quiet. "Do you always light candles before dinner?" I asked. "Only when it feels like someone might stay." I looked at her, then not the kind of glance you throw across a room, but the kind you hold when you're trying to decide if something real is happening. I told myself it wasn't. That this was just 2 people passing time, but the way the room held us, it felt more than that. As I stood to leave, Melissa didn't walk me to the door. She stayed in the kitchen rinsing a cup. I paused at the threshold, unsure. "If you come again," she said without turning around. "You don't need a reason." "If you come again," she said without turning around. "You don't need a reason." I didn't mean to stay long that night. I told her I'd just dropped something off. But she was slicing apples in the kitchen and asked, "Do you want to help?" It was simple, casual, but her voice had a softness that made it feel more like a question about presents than produce. I set the bag down and washed my hands at the sink. The house smelled like cloves and whatever she was slow cooking on the back burner. There was a jazz record playing again, something mellow with an old crackle that made the silence feel warmer. I noticed she always played music when the house was quiet enough to hear thoughts. She handed me a knife and a cutting board. I stood beside her, not sure if I was supposed to copy her style or just try not to ruin the slices. The rhythm of chopping was oddly soothing. She didn't fill the air with conversation, just let the space between us grow comfortable in its own way. "Do you always cook like this?" I asked. Melissa smiled. "Like what?" "Slow, quiet, like it's part of something else." She paused mid-cut, the knife hovering over the apple. "Cooking's the only thing I never rush, even when I'm sad. Maybe especially then." I didn't ask why she was sad, but the way her hands moved afterwards, slower, more deliberate, made me wonder how many meals had carried her through grief. Ali wandered in tail, swaying gently. He rested his head on my ankle, and I reached down instinctively. Melissa noticed. "He's a good judge of people," she said. "Doesn't get attached easily." "Neither do I replied before thinking. It came out too fast, too honest. She glanced at me briefly, but said nothing. We finished the apples. She moved around the kitchen with the quiet certainty of someone used to being alone, but not necessarily choosing it. I watched her from the side as she reached for the cinnamon, the way she always used cloth towels instead of paper, how her sleeves were always pushed up unevenly. Little things, real things. I stayed for dinner. No plan, no formal offer. I just didn't leave, and she didn't ask me to. We talked about movies. Or rather, she did. She liked the older ones, black and white mostly. Stories where people didn't say everything out loud. I told her I didn't watch many films, and she said then, "Maybe we'll find one you'll like." I don't remember what time I finally stood to go. But as I stepped toward the door, she followed me this time, stopping just before the threshold. There was a moment where neither of us moved. I didn't want to assume anything. She didn't reach for a hug, didn't offer one either. But her eyes lingered on my hoodie like she wanted to say something and chose not to. "I left something here last time, didn't I?" I said, trying to fill the silence. She tilted her head. "What?" I pointed toward the towel still folded neatly by the couch. "That." Her smile returned smaller now. "It's yours if you ever need it again." I didn't know what to do with that sentence. It stayed with me all the way out to the street. As I walked toward the scooter, the porch light stayed on. I didn't turn it off. Neither did she. The fourth time I came, she didn't answer the door. The porch light was on, but the window was dark, and for the first time there were only her footprints on the snow. They led away from the house, soft, solitary impressions in a fresh blanket that hadn't yet frozen over. It hadn't even been that cold the night before, but something in the stillness made it feel sharper than usual. I stood there for a while, holding the paper bag with leftover pastries I'd picked up for her. They were still warm, but that didn't matter now. I didn't knock again. Just stood there, watching the empty porch like it might explain itself if I waited long enough. The house was silent. No music, no kettle whistle, not even Ali barking from inside. The candle that used to flicker behind the window was missing. I glanced toward the side table where there was always a second cup. That evening, it wasn't there. I didn't know what I was waiting for. Maybe a flicker of light, a noise. Any reason to believe she'd step out and say, "Sorry, I was just upstairs." But she didn't. I placed the bag gently at the foot of the door and turned to leave, trying not to look back. The following day, I didn't pass by. The day after that, I made myself busier than usual. My mind replayed her voice, that calm certainty, when she said, "You don't need a reason." But suddenly, I did. I needed something to hold on to, some explanation for the quiet. 3 days later, I circled back. The porch light was off. The wreath was gone. It hit me in an odd way how fast an ordinary detail once familiar could feel like loss. I stood at the edge of her yard, helmet in hand, trying to decide if I should even try again. Then I noticed the curtain shift, just a sliver. Barely enough to say it happened. But I knew it did. I walked to the door, knocked once, then twice. Footsteps. Slow, hesitant. She opened the door halfway. Her face was tired, her hair loosely tied, a sweater I hadn't seen before wrapped too tightly around her frame. There was no smile. No welcome, just her eyes. "I thought maybe you weren't coming back," she said. Voice quiet, but not cold. I wasn't sure I should. A pause hung between us. She looked down at the bag in my hand. Today's offering was just tea, a simple pouch I thought she might like. "I wasn't ready to have anyone in the house," she said finally. "Not even you," I nodded. "You don't have to explain, but you came anyway." She added more to herself than to me. This time, she didn't ask me in. Just stood there, the door slightly open enough to keep the cold from fully reaching me. I didn't move closer. "I left the cup out for days," she said suddenly, eyes darting toward the side table behind her. Then I put it away. A silence. "You can leave the tea," she whispered. I held it out. Her hand brushed mine just briefly. As she took it, our eyes met again, but hers didn't linger. And just like that, she closed the door. She left the door open this time. I didn't even have to knock. Just the sight of it ajar, warm light spilling onto the porch. Steam fogging the windows inside sent something shifting quietly in me. A quiet kind of welcome. Or maybe just a truce. I stepped in slowly, wiping my shoes on the mat, even though the snow had already melted. Ali padded over tail low and bumped his head gently into my knee. I scratched behind his ears. The house felt the same and different, all at once familiar, but with a cautiousness in the air, like stepping into a conversation that had been paused halfway through. Melissa was in the kitchen back to me, stirring something on the stove. She didn't turn when I came in. "There's tea," she said simply. "Same cabinet as last time." I made it quietly. The water was already hot. I noticed the extra cup already on the table. We sat across from each other without small talk, just the sound of spoons clinking against ceramic and the low hum of the fridge. "You left," I said after a while, not an accusation, more like a question that had waited too long to be spoken. Melissa didn't flinch. I needed quiet. I thought I wanted company, and then I didn't. "It's okay," I said, though I wasn't sure it had been. I just didn't know what changed. Her fingers traced the rim of her cup. "You made me remember things I'd buried deep. Not bad things, just things I wasn't ready to feel again." We sat with that truth between us. I didn't press. She didn't soften. After a while, she stood and walked to a drawer, pulling out something small, a folded photo edges worn. She slid it across the table. "My son," she said. "He'd be your age now." I looked at it. A boy, maybe 5, in a red sweater, smiling up at someone outside the frame. "He passed when he was 7, she added quietly. "Car accident." I stopped letting people stay after that. Until you. I didn't know what to say. So I didn't say anything. I just reached out and placed my hand near hers on the table, not touching, just close enough to be felt. "You remind me of him," she whispered. "But not in the way you think." Her voice trembled on the last word, but she didn't pull back. The silence returned, but it was different now. Heavy and fragile. Real. Outside, the wind pressed gently against the windows. The house, old as it was, creaked like it remembered things too. Then softly, the sound of a chair being pulled back. Melissa stood, walked to the living room, and without a word lit the candle on the side table. I followed, sitting down where I always had. She didn't say stay. She didn't need to. And when she finally looked at me, it wasn't through the past anymore. It was now. She didn't say goodbye when I left. Just handed me a folded towel and said, "You know where the key is if it rains again." There was no hug, no lingering in the doorway, just her voice calm and even, like we'd arrived at something unspoken and agreed not to name it. I held the towel for a moment longer than I needed to. It smelled faintly of cinnamon, like her sweaters always did. She turned back into the house before I could say anything else, leaving the door half open. Ali watched me from the threshold, his ears flicking once before he too disappeared inside. The street outside was still wet from an earlier drizzle. Not quite a storm, but enough to leave puddles in the cracks of the sidewalk. I stood there unsure if I wanted to walk or wait for the clouds to break. Something had shifted between us. But it wasn't a confession, and it wasn't closure. Just the quiet realization that presence sometimes matters more than answers. In the weeks that followed, I didn't always stop by. Some days I only passed her street slowly, just enough to glance at the porch. Other times I'd find myself there without planning to be, like muscle memory, pulling me to the rhythm of something familiar. She didn't always open the door, but on the evenings she did, there'd be tea. Sometimes a book left open on the armrest. The same soft jazz humming from a speaker older than either of us. We never talked about the photo again. We didn't need to. One afternoon I brought a potted plant. She didn't say thank you, just placed it by the window and watered it in silence. Another evening she asked if I liked pear jam. I didn't, but I said yes anyway, just to keep the moment from ending. And so we continued. A slow unfolding. Not love, not yet. Maybe not ever. But something steady, like a house that never locks its front door but never asks you to come in either. Weeks turned into months. One day I passed by and noticed the porch light was off. Not unusual, not alarming, but enough to make me pause. I didn't knock. I didn't go in. I just stood there, remembering the way her hands paused mid-air when slicing apples, how she always lit a candle before sunset, how she said my name like it didn't carry any weight. When I finally turned to leave, I glanced through the window one last time. The candle on the side table was still burning. The porch remained quiet that evening, but the candle on the side table was still burning, casting a soft glow across the empty room. He didn't knock. Just stood there for a moment, long enough to remember the sound of her voice without needing to hear it. Some connections never ask for a name, they simply wait for the rain. And the towel folded neatly on the bench hadn't been moved. If you've ever found a piece of yourself in the quiet corners of this story, leave a 1 in the comments. And don't forget to like and share if you'd want someone to sit beside you in silence through a few tender lines.